present at any other time, I will change this. So, let's see, Mr. Sean Black, just respond by saying here or present, please. Dr. Matthew Cheeseman. Mr. Casey Corey. Miss Lucy Edwards. Mr. John Elridge. Miss Tiffany Farrell. Mr. Stephen Gay. Forgive me, but I'm not hearing anyone say anything, and I'm looking at the names. Have all the people who I see Tiffany. Tiffany, can you guys hear when people are saying here? We're not hearing them.
We can hear you.
Okay, and I just heard you, Andrew.
Yeah, I don't think that they've, I don't think they're here.
Okay. All right. Well, I see that Tiffany's here. Frida's here. Okay. All right. Miss Jessica Hofstetter. Dr. Houlihan.
Present.
Thank you. Miss Margaret Howard. Miss Tina Lance. Luann.
Present.
Thank you. Let's see, Dr. Robert Lupke. Dr. Bradley Mills.
Present.
Thank you. Miss Lisa Phillips.
Good morning.
Good morning. Miss Lily Seymour. Miss Naja Trez.
Present.
Thank you. Miss Lisa Von Dolan.
I'm here.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Miss Jenny Watson. Miss Tamika Walker Kelly.
Present. Good morning.
Good morning. And Miss Jamette McEastern. And forgive me if I mispronounced anyone's names. That's definitely not my intent. And as we go through, I will start, if I see someone come in, I will make sure I mark you as being present.
This is Tiffany Farrell. I'm present. I think that I was muted.
All right, got it. Thank you. Thank you. All right. So next we will have the reading of the ethics statement. Now, Dr. Houlihan, we have in the agenda, because we're supposed to be going over quite a few things, and I am not on my laptop this morning, so please forgive me. And I am using some items that I'm not used to having. So we do want to have the ethics statement, and we do have our chair, Dr. Houlihan. I will be supporting with the parliamentary procedures, so I want to make sure I just turn the meeting over to him. I will be introducing our new member of the committee, and I wanted to ask if Dr. Houlihan, if you would go ahead and read the ethics statement.
Sure thing. Good morning, everyone, and welcome committee members, advisors, staff, on-site visitors, and online listeners to the January 17th, 2024 meeting of our American Rescue Plan Committee of Practitioners. As a reminder, this is an advisory committee to the Office of Learning and Recover and other units within the North Carolina DPI. And the purpose of the committee is to advise, provide feedback to the state in carrying out its responsibilities under the American Rescue Plan. The duties of the committee are solely advisory and include to provide feedback to the state in carrying out its responsibilities, to review before publication any proposed or final state rules or regulations created, and to carry out any other responsibilities as directed by the federal law, the state board, or the Office of Learning and Recovery. As Richard said, I'm pleased to serve as the new chair of this committee. As a reminder, the agenda is online through the DPI website, and I will now read the ethics statement. Committee members are reminded that it is our duty to avoid conflicts of interest and the appearance of conflicts of interest as we handle the work of this committee. Does any member of the committee know of any conflict of interest or any appearance of conflict with respect to any matters coming before us at this meeting? If so, please state them for the record. If during the course of the meeting you become aware of an actual or apparent conflict of interest, please bring that matter to my attention. It will then be your duty to abstain from participating in discussion on the matter and from voting on the matter. And now we need an approval of the agenda. Committee members, you've had the chance to review the proposed agenda for today's meeting. Do I have a motion to approve the agenda for today's meeting?
So moved.
I need a second, please.
Lisa Phillips, I second it.
Thank you. Any discussion? All in favor, please say aye or raise your hand.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Okay, next I need a motion to approve the minutes from the October 30th, 2023 meeting. Do I have a motion to approve those minutes?
I am putting those in the chat right now, Dr. Houlihan.
Okay.
So moved.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. All those in favor? Aye.
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 Thank you all. Now I'm going to turn it over to back to Richard, and he is going to introduce a new member of our committee. So Dr. Lewis, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you. We have with us today Dr. Jamette McEachern, who is the most recent Principal of the Year in Cumberland County. She started her career as an ELA teacher, and we'd like to welcome her to the committee. She has been suggested by one of our teammates, and she was approved by the board at the last meeting. So again, help me in welcoming Dr. McEachern. And if I mispronounce your name, please forgive me, and look forward to working with you. Thank you. And I'll now turn it back over to Dr. Houlihan.
Thank you and welcome to our new member. All right, so now we're going to get a few updates from staff from DPI. So I'm going to turn it over, I believe, to Rachel, if I'm not wrong, and she will provide those updates for the committee.
Thank you. And I'm actually going to turn it to Andrew. He's going to kick us off today. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for jumping on here and being flexible as we kind of shifted the modality here from being in person to completely virtual. As you guys well know, there's lots going on outside, both with illnesses and weather. I think Wake County Schools was on a 2-hour delay today as well. So lots of moving parts, but you're here with us. Hopefully you're somewhere warm. We're going to walk through a few updates from the Office of Innovation, lots of exciting updates as it really relates to the American Rescue Plan and as it relates to the kind of the next phase of ESSER. You can go into the next slide, Richard. I want to talk a little bit about the work of the Office of Learning Recovery. Are you able to go to the next slide, Richard?
There we go.
Oh, there you go. Okay, awesome. So I just want to talk a little bit about the ESSER funding cliff. So if you don't have a countdown at home with you or in your office, there are 256 days left in ESSER. So tracking toward September 30th of 2024. And you all well know that at that point, the largest influx of cash in most of our history into education will end. And so we've been working really hard inside of the Office of Learning Recovery and the Office of Innovation to develop supports for our PSU leaders so that they can approach the funding cliff in a really strategic and intentional way. And that for us is a culmination of what are like the three parts of the Office of Learning Recovery. So the Office of Learning Recovery includes the Office of Research and Evaluation. It includes the Office of Innovation, which holds the Promising Practices Clearinghouse, as well as the formal element of like the ESSER experts and Rachel's team. Together, they form the Office of Learning Recovery, and they provide supports to PSU leaders to kind of get us through this next 9 months or so. So what you'll see this kind of play out today is, number one, Jenny Korn, who leads the Office of Research and Evaluation, she's working to develop new data sets to help PSU leaders understand where they've been, how they've recovered from the pandemic, and areas for need that we might continue to fund beyond ESSER. But these new data visualizations are kind of one of a kind. We'll talk through one of them in just a second, but they provide visualization to student need. We then pair that with the Promising Practices Clearinghouse, which has, I believe, 116 promising practices here in North Carolina, where we specifically point out what works. And so you might think that Jenny's team can show you where your need is. Angie Mullinex's team can show you what are some suggestions for things that work. And then finally, as we talk about Rachel's team, she's looking at how we examine the return on investment for previous investments and how we might be able to sustain that through this new ESSER funding cliff toolkit that she'll talk about. So it's the culmination of those teams that really, we believe, provide support to PSU leaders, and you'll hear a little bit more about that today. This is the biggest focus for our group over the next 256 days to prepare folks. On the next slide, I'm going to walk through actually Dr. Korn's slides. She's actually, she's double booked on presentations, but I want to kind of walk through North Carolina's road to recovery for what we call evidence-based policymaking. And that starts with some funding that we received from the General Assembly. On the next slide, you'll see that we received about $500,000 each year of the biennium to partner with SAS. And we've been partnering with SAS for some time to provide you with learning loss reports. And this is a continuation of that. And so, again, this goes to the point of we want to show you the most accurate data with visualizations to all kinds of student groups to understand where the need might exist in schools. On the next slide, I'm going to show you a little bit of the history of where we've been with this work with SAS. You might recall last year around this time, we were crisscrossing the state in these regional strategic planning sessions, and we were supporting PSU leaders with understanding what was known as the cohort model, the impact of lost instructional time and recovery. That was in 2022 and 2023. And you might remember these data visualizations where we were showing you over time how students were progressing after the pandemic. And we looked at, again, many types of student groups. We cut the data in ways we've never cut it before. So, for example, when you looked at those cohort models, you could specifically look at military-connected kids. You could look at students who lived in more urban centers than rural. And provided, again, new ways of thinking about student need. Now, this year, we're actually pivoting to a newer model, which is the year-over-year model. And it's one of a kind. It's the first of its kind across the nation, actually. And that's actually what Jenny's doing right now. She's talking to other state leaders about this model. But it provides a longitudinal look at the impact of the pandemic, but also its recovery. And so what I'll mention here, and you'll get the links to all of these things as well, is that we have this information at the state level, and soon you'll have access to it at your PSU and school level. So I'm going to do my best to try and explain a little bit about this new year-over-year model, knowing that Jenny's really the expert in this space, but I'm going to try my hand at it. So on the next slide, I'm going to show you a little bit about what it's designed to do. Actually, if you go back to that slide 14, there you go. So this year-over-year model is designed to answer a few questions. So first, it's designed to answer a question we heard over and over in the field, as well as at the state board, and that was, how will we know when we've fully recovered? So how do we know when we've gotten past the pandemic as it relates to learning recovery? And also, how do we quantify that? And what might be some of the local context that impacts the recovery? And so we worked with the experts at SAS and EVOS for probably 6 to 8 months to really push them to say, we have previous models. We want a new model that helps to answer these exact questions. And we're really excited that they decided to think through that with us. And we came up with what's known as the year-over-year model. Now, on the next slide, I'm going to show you an example of what it looks like. There's a lot going on this slide, and I'm going to do my best to explain what you're looking at. So this is a specific example at the state level for EOG results for 3rd grade. And so let me walk through the components, and then I'll kind of pull this together for you. So in purple, the dots that you see are scale scores. So that's kind of a new metric that we're asking for SAS to use. You'll see scale scores across the state for reading grade 3 on EOGs. What you'll notice is that this goes back to 2013. So it's a longitudinal view of progress being made around reading grade 3. What you'll also notice is the black line that extends down is the trajectory. So that's kind of like the line of best fit for those purple dots, which are actual state level scale scores for reading grade 3. Now, what may or may not surprise you is that we've been on a downward trajectory with 3rd grade reading across our state. So once you get to the 2019, 2020 zone, we're starting to get into the pandemic. And so probably no surprise to anyone here, the year we tested after COVID, you'll notice there's not a year in 2020. The actual scale score there is probably in the 536 zone, and it's much lower. So you'll then see that the actual scale score for 2022 is higher and is making progress. In 2023, it's continuing to make progress. So there's a real highlight here around reading grade level 3 at the state level. Now, there are some dotted lines here, and the dotted lines are designed to show us and answer the question, how will we know when we've recovered in reading grade 3? So the dotted black line is a continuation, obviously, of the previous trajectory for 3rd grade. So we just continue that on. So had the pandemic not happened, this is where we would imagine we would be. For example, in 2023, you can see that it would have continued on a negative trajectory. The blue dotted line is an average of 3 years. So that's from 2017 to 2019, so the years right before the pandemic. So we wanted to provide you with both a long-term view of where we may have been, as well as a shorter-term view. And so in this model, what you can see is that if the pandemic had not happened, reading grade level 3 actually would be above where we expected it to be. So there's progress being made there. So again, this is designed to show and answer the question, have we recovered from the pandemic, using those 2 different thresholds. Now, on the next slide, I just want to remind everybody, so as you're looking at these, that in the shaded blue and up until about obviously midway through 2020, we we see the pre-pandemic data. Yellow is the pandemic, so that's where all of the pandemic learning loss occurred, and then you can see recovery beyond that. So I just want to make sure that's kind of parsed out as far as if we overlay it with the pandemic timeline, so you can see its impact. On the next slide, this looks at the percentage of schools who have overall improvement in various assessments. So this is the number of schools who have shown improvement since the pandemic. So let me give you the example. EOG Math 3, almost 95% of schools across North Carolina that are elementary have shown improvement in those math EOG scores. So you can see, by and large, math, we've seen quite a bit of improvement. But what's important to know is that for 5% of schools, they still have not seen improvement since the pandemic. And so we're trying, this is designed to help understand who needs that intensive support to make sure we're continuing to improve. Now, where the story changes a bit is when we look down in reading. And so you can see, for example, in reading grade 7, we have 58%, 59% of schools have shown improvement, but we're still looking at over 40% of schools who have not shown improvement since the pandemic in reading grade 7. So this helps us identify where we feel like progress still needs to be made, but where there's also some celebration. So reading grade 3 and grade 4 are clear areas of celebration for the work that's happening in our schools as well. Now, a caveat here is that what you may know from the cohort models that we showed you last year is that we saw much more loss in math. And so it might be a logical hypothesis to think that because we saw so much loss in math during the pandemic, that it might be logical we would see some type of improvement there. We didn't have as much loss in reading, and there's some theories there as well. So what we know is that during the pandemic, we were still using some of our reading skills. Our kids were still using those at home, but math is much less likely to be used than obviously reading. So these are just some of the overall trends as we've seen them. Now, we have this data for all of the tested subjects at the state level as well. For today's presentation, we just wanted to show you an example of it, but we would welcome you to look at the actual presentation to the state board, which is pretty much just this, and you can see how the other grades have trended. On the next slide are a few kind of the ways we're going to bring this data to our PSU leaders across the state. So the first way we'll be doing that is we are going to have facilitated regional convenings, and I'm not going to steal Rachel's thunder, she's going to talk about those in a second, where we're going to be unveiling the year-over-year model, diving deep into that data and working with PSU leaders on how to use that to make good financial decisions and policy decisions moving forward. So that will be happening in February. Our understanding is that we will be disseminating the overall year over year. I believe it's going to be this week. It's going to be inside of a secure shell through accountability to our PSU's leaders. So they'll get the data, and then in a few weeks, we'll have an opportunity to dive deep with them, answer questions, sit with them, and help plan. We are also going to be using this data to help us think about proposals to the federal government, as well as philanthropic groups, to say, here are areas where we know we have clear need. How can we find funding to support those across our state? So that's how we're going to use this data in whole. And then lastly, on the next slide, I want to just say that there's some areas that are emerging as priorities for us. When you dive into that data, at least at the state level, there's something going on with science. And so I believe it's grade 8 science and some of our math subjects, we're seeing a dip from last year. And so that is an area of note for us. And so we're going to be looking at specifically what type of interventions might be available for math and science, and making sure that we commit to understanding what's going on there at kind of the local level, and then if needed, looking at ways to support them with funding and interventions. But there are areas of celebration. Early grade literacy is clear that folks are doing a great job at helping kids get past the pandemic, as well as progress in math. So we'll be continuing to look at this data, working in those regional sessions to understand the local context for what's happening, and then making plans for how we'll support PSUs moving forward. So lots of data there. I'm happy to take any questions if folks have them. I might have to defer real technical questions to our research team and we'll get back with you. But if there's any questions that folks have, I'd be happy to take those before I move into my final topic. Yes, ma'am.
Good morning.
Morning.
With the chart that shows the year-over-year trends, do you know that when presented, if it notates when the EOG tests have been renormed, and that effect on how that data is presented?
That's an excellent point. When the vice president for SAS was presenting to the state board, we got a very similar question around that. And I believe there was a math renorm or a new test, and they used their statistical models to represent that to get the new data point. So they did take that into consideration. I'd have to defer to our research partners to give you the statistical process they used for that. But they did take that in consideration. You're exactly right. Some of the tests did change and were normed, and so they had to take that into consideration. All right. If you think of other questions, just let us know. Happy to provide any context that we can for you on those as well. The next kind of brief thing I want to tell you about is an exciting opportunity across our state, and that's the North Carolina Recovery Practitioners Network. And on the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit about how we came about this network. In talking with both the state board, local superintendents, PSU leaders, there was a clear need to provide PSU leaders with opportunities to build capacity around research and evaluation. And when we heard that, Dr. Korn's team kind of took that personally to say, at the state level, they're working through what it looks like to do research and evaluation within the agency. How can we help build capacity of PSU leaders, no matter what your resources might look like across the state? So, we have a vast difference in the number of types of PSUs. So we have our folks who are very small and who the leaders of those schools and districts wear lots of hats. And we have larger institutions where there are distinct units. And so we kind of wanted to provide a way to level the playing field so that everyone has access to capacity around research and evaluation in their local context. And so through funding from ESSER, about $500,000, and from funding from the North Carolina Collaboratory, which is an organization that does research across our state funded by the GA, we were able to come up with the North Carolina Recovery Practitioners Network. And this, again, is to build local capacity. On the next slide, you'll see the area of the individuals who are involved. So this is a collaboration between DPI, the School of Education at UNC Chapel Hill, again, the Collaboratory, but also experts in the field of ensuring that practitioners have the skills they need to do kind of action research and evaluation. And so that's Carrie Conaway from Harvard and Nora Gordon from Georgetown University. And so this is kind of our project team, and we are about 4 months into this work, and we are supporting local PSU leaders who applied to be part of the process with making good research problem of practices and then acting on those to make decisions in their schools. So on the next slide, you'll see kind of the purpose of this. Again, it's to help them work specifically with a researcher from across North Carolina. As you well know, we have a really world-renowned system of universities in North Carolina. And we reached out to the researchers across the UNC system and said, who would be willing to sit with a PSU leader to think deeply about a problem of practice? And we really didn't know how many hands might be raised in that setting. And what we found was that over 70 faculty members from across the UNC system said, we'd love to sit next to a team of PSU leaders who are really interested in diving deep into a problem of practice and helping them think about best practices in research and design. So for those of you who've been through like the doctoral process, it's kind of similar. It's almost like a group of practitioners from a PSU have something that they're looking to research, and they get to sit with their chair of their committee, a seasoned research faculty member who's guiding and mentoring them through that process. And so we actually have our second meeting on Friday, and they're doing a book study that was designed by the two researchers from Harvard and Georgetown, and they're working their way through this process. And so, our goal with this is to build their capacity, and our final hope for them is that they pitch their idea, and then funding from the collaboratory will fund their research project, and that they will have kind of the power of the research faculty member as well as some funding to do some in-depth research on whatever their problem of practice might be. So on the final slide, you'll just see some of those intended outcomes, but it's really to bridge conversations between faculty leaders across our state and PSU leaders to have a deep understanding for how we recover from the pandemic and understand contextualized problems of practice. So we're really excited about this. This is, again, a partnership that is pretty unique across the country, where we are intentionally putting researchers with expertise in specific areas with practitioners. So they're actually, I think Dr. Houlihan has a team that's in this space, and there's about, I believe there's 16 PSUs who are involved in this. And our hope is that it continues to go well, and we can fund this beyond ESSER and do a second cohort of this so we can continue to build capacity. So happy to take any questions with that, but that's kind of the end of my spiel around research and evaluation as it relates to the ARP and ESSER.
Awesome. Thank you, Andrew. Great information. We appreciate you being here and giving us the update. I think now we're going to turn it to Rachel, who's going to give us a few updates around support suggested by our committee, as well as the Fiscal Cliff Toolkit and some feedback on that. So Rachel, I'll give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody, again. So I'm going to share just a brief update to start about the Fiscal Cliff, and then Dr. Mullinex is going to give a brief update, and then I believe we have some discussion items that Dr. Houlihan will facilitate a little bit later on around some specific feedback we're looking for on this fiscal toolkit. So last time that we met, we talked with you all a bit about this idea of return on investment. And what we really wanted to do was create something that would assist district and school leaders in evaluating the return on investment of their various ESSER-funded programs. If you're in a district leadership role or a school leadership role, you may have received our ESSER funding cliff toolkit, which we rolled out right before the holidays, and then we resent it out right after the new year as well, and hosted some webinars last week as an introduction to the toolkit. So you may have received it already, seen it already if you're in one of those roles, but if not, we are going to share that with you in just a few minutes in the chat so that you can look through it. But with this toolkit, what we've done is we've created really a suite of tools that are meant to support a data-driven approach to evaluating investments and designing budgets in PSUs and charter schools in a post-ESSER world. So one of the things that we really want to encourage districts and schools to do right now is take stock of all of their investments, not just ESSER investments, but also how are they spending federal funding traditionally? How are they spending some of their maybe time-limited grants that they've also received from the federal government or state or local government, and determining what is working for their kids so that then they can make the determination of what to sustain and what to sunset. One of our fears is that we have seen a lot of innovation and innovative programs taking place through the use of these ESSER funds. And so our fear is that districts may have to get rid of those programs because they no longer have the funds to sustain. So what we want to do is help districts elevate those programs and have evidence to support that certain programs are working so that they can have those conversations with their team, with their board, with their county commissioners about why a certain program should remain and why we may opt to sunset a long-standing program. So on the next slide, we talk a little bit about the toolkit usage, and I'm going to drop the link to the Funding Cliff toolkit in the chat for you all so that you can look at that while I'm talking. So as you're going through the toolkit, I just want to talk a little bit about its intended use. First, I already alluded to this, but we designed this to support a systematic process that includes reviewing relevant data provided by our research and evaluation team, and also any relevant data that you have in your local context. Also determining return on investment for ESSER investments or other investments, depending on your objectives, and outlining a budget process that will help support the 24-25 budget planning year. The real goal of this toolkit is to drive conversations and collaboration among your team. So we advocate that district and school leaders bring together a group of key decision makers that should definitely include the superintendent or charter school leader, the chief finance officer, and any administrators with budgetary responsibilities, especially as they relate to ESSER. The collaborative process should encourage healthy and transparent dialogue that supports an understanding of which programs are working and which we may need to examine further. You're going to notice as you're going through the toolkit that there are 6 steps, and I'm going to kind of walk through those steps in just a second. But there's a brief description of each step, and then there's an explanation of how to use any tools that are associated with that step. So you'll notice that in step 2, we have a data dashboard. There's an explanation of how to best use that. In step 3, with determining ROI, we have an ROI tool. There's a lengthy explanation and even explainer doc of how to use the ROI tool. And so the toolkit will walk through each of those points. And then there are some discussion questions at the end of each step that's going to help your leadership team in having deeper discussions about each of these steps as you move through the process. So what we really suggest is that teams review the toolkit in its entirety and then determine how you want to move through it. It would take some dedicated time to review the data and discuss each section. So we do advocate that as a team, you all decide how to best do that within your own context. On this slide, you'll see the different steps. So we've broken this process down into 6 steps. They are chronological steps. They build upon one another. Step 1 is to determine the budget process and timeline. In this step, we provided PSUs with an editable budget timeline template and also some thinking templates that help leaders to get really clear on their goals and also to take a first look at student data as they are getting really clear on priorities and needs moving forward in the budgeting process. We think it's really important that leaders employ a backwards planning when it comes to looking at this budget process, and that timeline template allows leaders to do that. Step 2, PSUs collect data and evidence. The data and evidence that we the new data that we're providing in addition to the year over year is this fiscal cliff dashboard that has also been developed by our research and evaluation team. We're going to take a little bit of a deep dive into that a little bit later so that you all have more time to look at it. But the purpose of that dashboard is for districts and schools to be able to determine the magnitude of the fiscal cliff they might be facing. So we explain that in the toolkit. How can I determine what the magnitude of my fiscal cliff will be? How can I use these data to help inform that? And then also we provide links to several North Carolina education relevant dashboards that provide even more data and evidence to support discussion around effective programs and initiatives. In the third step, we determine the return on investment. So Andrew and I have worked together to develop an equation and a tool that will help PSUs to visualize the relative ROI of programs within the district or the charter school. The purpose of this tool is to facilitate deeper conversations and examination of programs based upon their return. And we're going to show you this equation a little bit later as well when we get some feedback from you all. But we want to give a high level overview because it's really easy to get in the weeds on this. So as a high level overview, essentially, this is a tool to facilitate conversations, and we'll go into the disclaimer and show you all the equation. But what we have created is essentially a fancy Excel spreadsheet that will calculate the return on investment of various programs and initiatives and help to kind of initiate those conversations at the leadership level around what seems to be working and what may need further examination. Steps 4 and 5, decision-making and budgeting, these go hand in hand. First, we have the decision-making process where leaders are going to have those tough conversations about what stays and what goes. And then we have the actual budgeting, of course, where we have to set budgets to support those selected programs, especially in the 24-25 year when we will no longer have ESSER. In these sections, we've included information about federal fund breaking as an option for assisting in the budgeting process. And then we have also included information about the zero-based budgeting process, which is, if you're not familiar with that, it's a process that's used in multiple industries that supports alignment of expenditures with strategic plans and goals. One reason that we decided to include this was that Andrew has had experience with that, with the zero-based budgeting process in his time as an assistant superintendent in Rowan Salisbury schools. And then additionally, what research has shown us that's been put out by Edgenomics Lab in Georgetown is that the average fiscal cliff that districts are facing is going to be between 4 and 6%. And zero-based budgeting has been shown to be able to scrub budgets and eliminate 4 to 7% of a previous year's budget. So that's why we are advocating and provided a template for the zero-based budgeting process as well. And then the final step in this process is communication. We know that transparency is going to be key, which is one of the reasons that we have this committee, is that we get your all's feedback to help us ensure that we're communicating effectively with all stakeholder groups around ARP ESSER investments. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this and get your feedback on this. But in this step, we've provided districts with several templates with vetted resources, and that have been vetted by communications experts around messaging, the end of ESSER, budget cuts, and position cuts. So again, we're going to go more in depth on that, but I just wanted to give you kind of an introductory overview before we have a discussion section. So if you can go to the next slide. And then obviously, I just talked a lot and it was a lot of information. And so to disseminate this information in a more effective way, in a more meaningful way, as I mentioned before, Andrew and I hosted some webinars to introduce these tools so that people could have some initial exposure, so we could front load and we wouldn't spend all of our time walking through the step-by-step of how to use each of the tools. So we did that last week. And then in February, along with our research and evaluation team, we're going to be holding whole day long sessions throughout the state. So we'll be in each of the state board regions, and then we'll have an in-person session for charter schools in a centralized location in the state, and then also a virtual option for charter schools as well. So we're actually structuring the agenda around the 6 steps that I just went over. Jenny and her team are going to be doing a deep dive into the new year-over-year data sets that are going to be released and ready for district and charter school leaders specific to their own districts. And then we'll also do a deep dive into how to use some of these NC Ed relevant dashboards that we have access to, but many people may not understand how to use them to inform this conversation around return on investment. So again, this is the information, and we're encouraging, and this is kind of something new that we're encouraging in terms of team. In the past, you may have seen that we encourage participation of superintendents, CAOs, cabinet level, but we're also really advocating for the inclusion of the CFO at these meetings because we believe that the CFO is central to these discussions. And we have actually gotten a really good response from that, but I thought that was important to share with this committee as well, that we really are trying to be intentional about also bringing in the financial experts within the charter school or district. To finish up our offices updates, I'm going to turn it over to Richard to briefly talk about what we're doing with the 20% set aside and some exemplars that we are setting up.
Good morning again, everyone. What we're doing now is that we are looking for exemplars of the 20% set aside that every PSU received in the state, and we're looking for new and unique or innovative ways to support recovery and acceleration that possibly could be transferred over to your fellow districts throughout the state. So I've been going through the PRC 181 plans, and I've looked for innovative narratives that were aligned with Operation Polaris, as well as the portrait of graduate durable skills. And I wanted to identify at least 2 PSUs, and that would be a charter and traditional, so that we could have a deeper discussion and make sure that these are promising practices. We plan on starting these on September the 20th, spring 2024. And all this exemplars will be added to the Promising Practices Clearinghouse. A lot of PSUs use the funds for multiple things, so it was not easy to come up with these exemplars. And I would love if any of the committee members, if in a later email, if you are aware of an initiative, whether in your district or a neighboring district, that I should take a look at, that you know they're using PRC 181 funds, also known as the 20% set aside. I would love to know about that. I will now defer to Dr. Mornax if she has anything she wants to add to this.
No, I think that's good, Richard. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mornax. And now we will move forward to the Office of Innovative Practices and Programs, which is from Dr. Angie Mornax, the Director and State Military Liaison.
Thanks, Richard. You can go to the next slide. So this is just a quick reminder that we have about 116 practices now in the Promising Practices Clearinghouse. We have now done that for 2 full calendar years, and so this is our 3rd calendar year. So there are several different ways you can filter out, because I know if you look at the map, it's just a lot of stars. So there are various ways that you can filter out and look for those practices that are specific to a particular context that you're trying to solve for. Because we have some practices that people have asked about that we don't necessarily have promising practices on, we're also including emerging practices this year. And so those will include things like school safety and transportation, where we have some pockets of things that are working, but they're not necessarily practices that the district leaders would put their seal of approval on and say have solved for those issues. So that will be an inclusion this year that will be coming out in the next month or so. And then like Richard said, we'll also include those 181 practices once those are complete. And that's it.
We now turn it back over to our chair, Dr. Houlihan.
Thank you. So now we're going to move into one discussion point really around feedback that DPI would like for this committee to provide around the ESSER support moving forward and the toolkit. So I'm not sure, I believe, Rachel, are you going to go over this slide deck? And then I believe there are some questions at the end that she would like for us to respond to.
Yes, sir. So thank you, Dr. Houlihan. I gave you like the broad overview of the Funding Cliff Toolkit. And Andrew, as I'm going through this, if I forget anything, just feel free to chime in, because Andrew and I did co-create this toolkit together. So what I really wanted to focus in on with this group is step 2, the collect data and evidence, step 3, determine return on investment, and then step 6, communication. So with each of these steps, we have some specific discussion items that we would like your thoughts on, your feedback on. So if you want to go to the next slide, Richard. The first is collecting data and evidence, which is step 2. So I mentioned earlier that we worked with one of the interns in our research and evaluation team to develop this ESSER funding cliff dashboard. And this has been created so that it can be filtered by PSU, including charter schools. So every individual charter school can see their information, and every individual PSU can see their information. I'm going to drop the dashboard in the chat right now so that you all can go ahead and access that. And if you would do me a favor, and once you open that up, if you would navigate to the PSU that either you represent or the PSU that's in the county where you live, however you want to look at that, or the charter school that you represent as well. And you can do that at the top of the screen. There's a drop-down menu. And as you do that, I'm going to actually talk through what's on the dashboard. So I'm going to pull it up. One second. And Richard, do you mind if I share my screen for this piece? Okay. All right, so as you can see here at the top, am I sharing? No, I'm not sharing yet. Okay, here we go. Now we're good. Okay, so at the top here, this is where you see the drop-down menu. And so you can select whichever school district or charter school that you would like to view. At the top, we have an overall expenditure visualization by funding source. So this shows you from 2020 to 2023, the expenditures in this particular PSU broken down by state, local, federal, and ESSER funding. We did a specific call out for 2023 expenditures since that was the last fiscal year, and broke that down by funding source, and then also did a specific call out of the percentage of expenditures that was made up of ESSER funds. So in this PSU, last fiscal year, 4.7% of all of their spending was from ESSER. And so the idea why we did this specific call out is we wanted districts and charters to be able to say, okay, there's a potential that I may need to cut my spending by 4.7% because I'm not going to have those ESSER funds anymore. Now, we know that this data is a year, that this expenditure data here is from last fiscal year, and there could be lots of caveats to where the district has already made plans to eliminate that 4.7%, but regardless, we did want to have that specific call out there. Then when you go down to this second section, this is where we're specifically looking at ESSER expenditures. Now you'll notice that up here, we only have it through the previous fiscal year because that's what we have complete data on. Here we did include the current fiscal year, 2024. These data here are through November. We pulled these data in November of 2023. So during this school year, we're hoping to have this further updated. We're working with the young man who helped us create this dashboard in order to have this even more updated. At least the hope would be through December of 2023 before our regional sessions. So the cool part about this visualization is a district leader can look at this and say, wow, you know, we spent a lot of money from ESSER in 2022. They can click on that, and then that's going to break it down to the object level. So then we'll see this and we'll say, oh, okay, I spent $25,152,000 and some odd dollars on salary. That's a lot. That's kind of a red flag if I'm just looking at it and saying this is salary straight out. But the good news is I can go down a level further within these object codes to an even deeper level of object codes. So I see that the majority of my salary was actually made up of bonus payments. And then I had some extended contracts. I did spend a significant amount on instructional facilitators, but if I look at 2023, I'm not really seeing those instructional facilitators. So that indicates that it seems that this particular PSU had a pretty solid plan in terms of salaries and how they were going to phase out some of these positions. We've also done a specific call out to salaries, as you'll see here, specific to positions. So down here for the last fiscal year, you will see specific positions. So this is the amount that I spent on teacher assistants last year, the amount I spent on tutor pay, the amount I spent on teachers. The reason we did this is we just really wanted to bring awareness to district leaders and the entire team for positions that were paid out of ESSER funds for last year. The hope is that district leaders and charter school leaders have a plan in place. They've either put these folks on contracts that end at the end of this school year, and they've made it clear that these positions will no longer be funded, or they have a plan for funding them with another fund source. But we did want to just make that call out so that we could drive home the point that, again, transparency is going to be key, especially when we're talking about folks' livelihoods. So beside the specific positions, we also have a student enrollment and teacher staffing trends. So this orange line represents the number of teachers, classroom teachers in a particular district. And then the blue line represents the student enrollment. This is another graph that we're looking to improve by updating with the most recent PMR data from PowerSchool. Because right now, again, this only represents through 2023. So this does not represent the current ADM in that particular district. Again, the reason we've included this is because we know that we've seen a decline pretty much statewide, especially in traditional districts with student enrollment. And so we really wanted to call attention to that because that's another important aspect of the budgeting process that we have to take into consideration as we're preparing for the future. And then at the bottom, we have the grade level effect sizes. So this is essentially the year-over-year model for last year, not the most recent one. We're hoping that if we do a dashboard for the most recent year-over-year data, that will also include this, but we wanted to provide visualization from a high level of student outcomes, because again, when we're talking about ROI, we want to make sure that we are looking at how our students are progressing when we're thinking through the effectiveness of some of our programs. So that is what the dashboard looks like, and I'll stop sharing my screen. Richard, if you...
Rachel, before you stop sharing your screen, do you mind showing them the difference between the table visualization and the graph visualization so they can see it at a more granular
Yes.
level?
Yes, good point. So here with the ESSER expenditures, you have two different options for the visualization. If you would rather view this as a table, which can be a little bit easier to see, especially when we get down to these little bitty bar graph sections here, you just click Show Table, and that will show you the object level code along the left side and then the amount expended from year to year. And I'm happy to take any questions on the dashboard. I'll stop sharing, Richard, if you want to bring back up your screen. I see Ms. Walker Kelly's hand raised.
Yes, so first I just wanted to say this is a great way to present a lot of data at one time in a way that is more easily understood by stakeholders. I did have a question regarding the very bottom where it says that it lists all the data sources that help compile this information. Is it possible that the data could be linked at the bottom where those sources are named, and that way people would have access to the raw data information?
Yeah, I don't see why not, because all of the data sources are public. Essentially, we've just combined all of it into one for a visualization. So thank you for that feedback. Yes, that's a good suggestion. Are there any other questions before we move to the discussion piece?
There are also questions in the chat that people have.
Recording in progress.
It should be.
Which color code are you referring to? In the dollar amounts or down in?
Right. When I click the table and there is a different shades of a dollar amount, I don't know if there is a specific legend or benchmark for that, or it's just level of expenditures.
I believe the darker the shade, the higher the expenditure, but we could probably look at that as well with the individual who helped develop this with us as well. That's a good point.
Yeah, that is a good point. But yes, it does. The darker, the deeper the shade, the larger the expenditure essentially on that second part. Okay. All right. So these are some discussion questions as you all are looking at the county where you live or the school district or charter school where you work. We wanted to know, in terms of looking at this dashboard, what data, if any, surprised you all the most? Do you have any areas of concern based on these data? How might districts and schools use this dashboard to assist in the post-ESSER budgeting process? And then any questions that you have about the data points. And if you would like to raise your hand and speak out loud, I think everybody has the ability to come off mute.
Feel free to join right in, anyone.
Hi, this is Luann Llewellyn, and I was just wondering, I have a concern about marginalized subgroups receiving the brunt of the fiscal cliff loss. Is there a way that this could be broken down so we could look at it in those subgroups?
So, subgroup achievement data at the very bottom of the document, or are you speaking to how those dollars were spent to serve the subgroups?
I'm actually thinking about both because I say they're probably run parallel with one another.
So yes to the achievement data. So the cohort data that I referred to in my presentation, that was the last year's data, is what this is built from. So we can get really granular at that, like levels of granularity that we've never had before around how students are doing academically. The financial data is not tagged in a way in our systems that allows you to see at the level of granularity that you're asking for. And I wish it was. And Rachel, you correct me if I'm wrong, but the way the financial systems are set up is that they're kind of in these buckets or object codes that allow us to look at things like salary, operations, and then we can go a level deeper to kind of understand what salary. But the data that's tagged to specific programs, that all kind of sits at the PSU level to understand what was used for who. I will say, and Rachel's much more of a expert in federal programs than I am, there are the applications to use federal dollars oftentimes require, I think, understanding who you're going to serve. Rachel, is that a possibility where you could use the CCIP applications to show some of that?
I was thinking regional meetings would be a really good time to bring that up to the team so that they really go in and look to see how the fiscal cliff is going to affect those subgroups like ML or EL, migrant students, homeless students, that whole repertoire of student groups that are still recovering from COVID interruption.
No, it's a great point. I love the idea that we would do it in context. And so you're going to see us, as we talk about the ROI tool, talk specifically about student populations and the intentionality around spending extra money on students who need it most. And that's a good thing. So I totally hear you that should be in the regional sessions. And so we'll certainly take that into consideration as we look at the final design of those meetings as well.
Yes, and to that point, Luann, thank you for bringing that up. We also, when we're thinking about looking at effectiveness of programs, especially at how they affect certain subgroups of students, especially if that's what the money was intended to be for, we could technically look at different PRCs design that come out of ESSER that were to target a specific subgroup. So for example, I'm just thinking off the top of my head with PRC 189, which is our academic enrichment programs for out of school time. So even though districts may choose to serve different racial or socioeconomic subgroups with those funds, those funds are specific for grades 4 through 8. So we could, look at the impacts of what that funding has done for those students, especially when we looked at the most recent year-over-year model. Our middle school kids continue to struggle in both math and ELA and science. So looking at the PRC level could potentially be an option. However, like Andrew said, just the way the financial system is set up, unfortunately, we don't have tags other than the PRCs to help kind of look at targeted subgroup information.
But in the regional sessions, and to your point, Naja, we could certainly bring that up, right? Like that you can, as a PSU leader, we may not have access to it at our level, but you have access to it and bring that up as a valid data point. So we'll take all this feedback as part of that design for that day.
Yeah.
Great points.
Rachel, I have a question for Andrew, and he won't be surprised by this. And I'll probably ask the same question on the ROI tool. So on your third bullet, how might districts and schools, in the drop-down menu of the Fiscal Cliff Toolkit, you can drop down and you can see individual charter schools, and then you can see individual PSUs, but you can't see individual schools within PSUs. So it's another drop down for districts that have allocated ESSER funds to schools who want their school leaders to use this tool. Is that going to be an option, or is that going to be too granular at this point in time?
We initially designed it around ESSER looking at the highest level, looking at district and charters. But we would need to work with our finance team to see, can we get the data at our level coded in a way that we can see your schools? I'm certainly willing to ask the question, because we feel like this, like, we're going to use this for ESSER, but it could certainly be used outside of ESSER, right?
And
Like,
that's what I was going to say,
like
you know,
financial
from a,
decision making.
right. And that's what I was going to say for moving forward in future
Yeah.
years, even when ESSER is gone, if this could be a viable tool that school leaders and data managers and others could use to navigate budget decisions, that might be helpful for at the local school level.
Yeah, I would love to be able to get at the school level, and we always, every data set we start with, it usually ends up at the state level, and then we try and get one decision unit smaller. And so let me see how that data is coded at the state level to understand if we have a way to see beyond just you as a district org, and to see. And if it's possible, then, and if the data is available, we've already written the code. So essentially it would be, and this is where I get in trouble because I think I logically understand what's happening, but it's probably much harder. If we have the code for how to pull this in for a PSU, we should be able to then just apply the same code at a one unit level smaller. So I'll take that as homework to see if we can't figure that out for that use case.
Well, I might save you some time on the homework because I know we can pull it at a school level. We would just need to verify the accuracy because when we look in BASS, all of your federal funds are coded. If you allocate them to a school, we can look at our financial system and see how much you allocated to that particular school for any of your PRCs. So I would just, Andrew, I guess we would just need to see about the accuracy of that and how easy it would be to pull. Because I know we can see it. I just don't know if Financial and Business Services runs a report like they do for the higher level stuff.
Yeah, and I think that is especially probably important. The larger the school system, you know, the harder it is to see, you know, what's actually happening. You know, as opposed to if you have 4 schools in your school system, it's a little easier to kind of estimate those. So yeah, let's look at it. Be happy to.
Would you like me to move forward to the next slide, or would you like me to stay here?
Ms. Walker Kelly has her hand raised.
Yes, I had a question. Following the question about on which populations funds were used on, my question is similar in that, so currently we're looking at it, we know that school districts spent a lot of necessary funds on salaries and benefits to, you know, retain educators and support staff during this time, which of course is part of a larger narrative around how people were using ESSER funds. But my question is it possible to also show in this dashboard where other places where ESSER funds were also used? Because we know that money was spent on like tutoring and additional programming, but it doesn't reflect that in this dashboard. And so if a member of the general public was to look at this dashboard, there's no additional information that shows what other things ESSER money was spent on beyond just educator positions in its school district.
So I'm sorry if I specifically went straight to salaries, but when you look at the second part of the ESSER expenditures, so we did a specific call out to salaries, but then we also have the other object codes such as supplies and materials, and capital outlay, purchase services, contracted services, things of that nature. Unfortunately, we couldn't say, for example, in the district that we were just looking at where they used a lot of funds for tutorial pay, we couldn't say definitively, this school system ran a high dosage tutoring program in their district, right? We would have to go and then look at their federal funding application, which is also public record through CCIP, to determine what specific programs. Because unless it's a specific program report code run through like the state, so the example I gave of like the 189, the academic enrichment, we know that's for after school academic programs. But when we're talking about big picture ESSER at the district, they're just using the object codes that are available to them, and we won't necessarily know what specific program that they allocated that towards. We can just see things like they paid for tutors, they paid for a specific technology program. So unfortunately, we can't get down to the nitty gritty in this dashboard of exactly what programs were utilized. Instead, that would require looking at the federal funding application through CCIP.
So I understand like the very specific granular details of like what each district level does, but they do have an object code that could then possibly be added to this table to be sorted, like spend this amount of money on this particular, in that is coded in this way. Is that possible?
No, the object codes that you see on the ESSER expenditures are the object codes that were coded within ESSER. So we could do, there are things called purpose codes, which are kind of specific, but not really. Like you can do a purpose code for extended day. So I could have a purpose code that was extended day plus tutors. So that would tell me I paid for tutors in some kind of program that was outside of the school day. But that's about as granular or as specific as you could get. And unfortunately, just being transparent, the purpose codes are not applied uniformly across the state. So the object codes are much more consistent.
But to the point of these regional sessions, the goal would be to ask the question you're asking, right? So to say, we can show you that you spent $1 million on tutors. What does that actually, like, what did you actually do with it? And then by bringing the correct people to the table, to those meetings, you got your CFO who could quickly look and see, where that's at. You got your federal programs person. Then it spurs the conversation that I think you're trying to drive around what exactly did we do with it? And then pairing that with academic success. So what did we do with it? Who did we serve? What results did we have from it? So, you'll hear us say this, everything we're building is driving conversation. And so we would want to drive that conversation that they should be able to know like the context for how they spent that. But it will be, to be able to share it on dashboards is the challenging part, but hopefully it'll drive the conversation.
Thanks. I think it would be really helpful to try to figure that particular piece out, just because, yes, there's a duty of the district to explain what they need, but also if there are other ways to display what they've applied for on the federal level, would be also extra helpful to stimulate that conversation.
All right, I think we're going to go ahead and move to the next point because we do have a lot of discussion items. Thank you all for sharing your feedback on this piece. So now we're going to move to determining return on investment. So this is step 3 in the process, and step 2 comes right before it with the collecting data and evidence, because it's going to be necessary for districts and schools to understand student outcomes when they are measuring return on investment. So if you know anything about return on investment in the traditional sense, it's a pretty straightforward ratio that divides our net profit by the total cost. And that gives us our return on investment. So I think in our regional sessions, Andrew was giving the example of if you are a person that flips houses in real estate and you buy a house for $1 million and you make $2 million in profit, then your ROI is pretty good if we're dividing $2 million by $1 million. And so that's a very straightforward example. But obviously, we do not generate profit in education. So we had to define what we would consider profit in an educational setting. And so we kind of grappled with this question, which is, what is the ultimate goal in education spending? And so we determined that the ultimate goal when we're spending money on certain initiatives and programs is to improve student outcomes. And so you'll see that in our equation, student outcomes is one of the pivotal variables in this ROI equation. We also factored in implementation fidelity when we're thinking about programming, because implementation fidelity is another integral part of assessing effectiveness of certain programs and interventions. So you'll see here in the ROI formula, we multiply our outcomes variable by our implementation fidelity variable, and then we multiply that by the number of students. And the reason that we multiply that by the number of students is because the more students we serve, if a particular program is impactful, then we would expect the ROI to be higher, right? We've also taken into consideration, kind of going back to what Ms. Llewellyn mentioned, we've also factored in a special populations multiplier. And so with this special populations multiplier, what we really wanted to get at was, we know that in districts and schools, a lot of times we have very targeted interventions or programs for a certain subset of students, which in turn means that we may serve less students because there are less students in that subgroup. So if I'm doing an intervention that specifically targets English learners, then I could use this special populations multiplier to take that into account, because I am serving less students, but I don't want that to diminish the ROI, especially if I'm seeing high outcomes for those students. And we'll give you a little example screenshot in just a second, because this is a very broad overview right now. So before we move to that screenshot, I do have to do some disclaimers. First of all, none of these ROI calculations should be used as an absolute in determining effectiveness. They should only be used to facilitate discussion. So when you work, when you play around with this tool, or if you're in a leadership role and you line up your investments and calculate the ROI, you should, we are not advocating that you should say that things with a low ROI should absolutely be sunsetted and things with a high ROI should absolutely be sustained. The purpose is to facilitate a deeper discussion and also take in those qualitative data points, because our equation really looks at student outcomes and implementation fidelity, which are a bit more quantitative in nature. So we would advocate for deeper discussions around, you know, things such as, is this a program that is a new program that may have not been implemented as long as some other programs, but it's showing promising leading indicators, for example? Or is this a program that we know if we get rid of it, it would negatively impact students and teachers because it has a socio-emotional benefit that we can't necessarily define quantitatively. So those are some disclaimers. And then also, this tool is specifically designed to assess recurring costs that are student-centered. So you would not assess the return on investment of an HVAC system that you used your ESSER funds to put into your school, or even it would even be difficult to assess something like bonus payments to teachers because we can't necessarily, other than maybe staff retention, we can't clearly tie that to the student outcome data. So if you'll go to the next slide, Richard. So what we this is a screenshot of the calculation tab on the ROI tool. Just some notes about this. In order to complete the tool, and this is included within the ROI or the Fiscal Cliff Toolkit, so you can feel free to play around with it and kind of see how it works. But in order to complete this, district and school leaders will have to know which investments and interventions they actually want to assess. So what do they want to put in the toolkit? The total amount that they've spent or budgeted on that particular investment or program, the rough approximation of students served, so the number of students served, and then the team will have to work together because, again, this is something that can only be done within the context of a single school district or single charter school. You all will have to decide as a team the level of implementation fidelity and the level of progress towards outcomes. So we have some variables here where you will rate yourself high, medium, or low for both fidelity and progress towards outcomes. So that's why as a team, it's really important to determine how will you define that. We give some suggestions in the explainer doc, but again, I think I forgot to mention this in my original disclaimer, but you can only use this within your own context. So we can't take this and compare Alamance Burlington to Wake County schools and look at the ROI, right? We can't compare across districts or across charter schools because this is going to be relative to what your team decides in terms of fidelity and progress towards outcomes. Then you'll determine if you have a special populations multiplier. So did that particular investment serve a special population? And then it will spit out this relative ROI number using the equation that I just covered. Districts and schools can then filter this from low to high, high to low, however you want to look at it. Larger ROIs obviously indicate more return on investment. And then you can compare ROIs across investment and discuss what items and investments should we consider going forward. So again, this is a discussion piece just to really help districts to engage in deeper discussions about what worked for kids and what didn't. Richard, if you can click the next slide for me. And then you can click one more time, I think. Yeah. So this is a screenshot of what districts or charter leaders would actually complete. So this is the planning tab. There's two tabs, a planning tab and a calculation tab. So here's where you would put in that information that I just mentioned, the total amount spent. If you served a special student population, we have an area where you can outline your outcomes. And in this example, you see green are the outcomes that we've achieved. Yellow means that we've begun to address that. We've addressed part of it. Red would mean that we did not meet that outcome. And this is just a suggestion for how to use it. And so then you would change, these are drop-down menu. You would change to high, medium, or low for progress towards outcomes. And same thing for implementation fidelity. And then Richard, if you click one more time. Then all of this gets translated into the calculation tab. So here we have two programs that are essentially the same in terms of total amount spent and total amount of students served. One was at an elementary school, one was at a middle school. The only difference we see here is the elementary had high outcomes and high implementation fidelity. The middle school had medium progress towards their outcomes and medium implementation fidelity. And so you can see here the difference in the ROIs. So obviously the program that had the higher outcomes, better implemented with fidelity, has the higher ROI. So that's just an example of how this works. Andrew, is there anything else that we need to say about the tool?
Just that it's meant to drive conversations in a new way. So, we know that like the initial ESSER funding was given to districts in a fast and furious manner. We didn't have long to spend it. And so there may or may not have been like really streamlined intentionality around how it was spent, but it's meant to drive conversations to say, just because we're we're going to fund a program, or let's say an ed tech tool, we're going to give $100,000 to an online tutoring program, thinking about it up front to say, well, what do we expect to get out of that investment? Like, what are reasonable gains in student learning that we expect from that? And that we hold ourselves accountable to both implementation fidelity, so doing what we said we were going to do, and then holding ourselves accountable to, did we get the results we expected? And if we're not getting those results, are we willing to do things differently about how we implement it? Or are we willing to say, it's just not working as we intended? It's being really intentional about educational funding. And so it obviously has deep importance during ESSER, but beyond September 30th, it's going to have an important role as well, because we're going to be cutting budgets and we're going to be saying what's working, what's not. So we hope that this drives conversations, or specifically at kids, like what outcome are you hoping to achieve by this budget item? That would be the big kind of takeaway for me from this.
So we just really wanted to show you all that. This again is going to be a really central piece to our discussion in the regional sessions, and to the point that was brought up earlier about looking more deeply at planned expenditures to address student subgroups. Like, this is where districts and charter schools can really get into that nitty gritty of looking at their plans and saying, this is what we said we were going to do. This is what we hoped that would happen. And so we're hoping that the regional sessions will allow for that. Richard, if you can go to the next slide, because I'm going to go ahead and move. And then if we have any questions after I go through this section, please just feel free to come off mute or type them in the chat. The last piece, and the piece that I would really like this committee's feedback on, is the communication piece. So we know that it is very important to get stakeholder feedback for the planning of a post-ESSER budget, and then also to be transparent with various stakeholder groups when it comes to thinking about the potential to cut certain programs or even positions within a district or school. So Richard, if you can go to the next slide. I already mentioned that we provided some templates for district leaders, and we're going to talk a little bit more with them about that in the regional sessions. But for this group, I do have these discussion questions, because we would like to incorporate some of your feedback into those regional sessions around how we can be really effective at communicating with various stakeholder groups. So one question I have is, how might different stakeholder groups react to the end of ESSER funding? And of course, this may be dependent on how transparent communication has been from the start, but even thinking about students, teachers, parents, principals, et cetera, all of those different stakeholder groups. Then what strategies can be employed to address their concerns or questions? So we'd really love to hear some of your thoughts about some strategies that district leaders could use based on your position to address concerns around the end of ESSER funding. And then from your perspective, what role do stakeholders play in the budget decision-making process, and how can stakeholder input be effectively solicited and integrated into planning and decision-making? So I'm going to put myself on mute. If you'd like to raise your hand and come off mute, or put it in the chat, feel free, and we'll be taking notes.
Hi, this is Luann. I'm just going to go ahead and unmute. Where one of my concerns, of course, would be for stakeholder groups is our MLEL, migrant parents and family members. They're a very important stakeholder group for us. And I think we can give things in text or all the time, but a lot of our parents lack, or many of our parents lack, the ability to read in English or even in their native language to the point to really get the information from this. So I'd love to see some videos of this and some screencast so that they can look at it, understand it, and then we can lead those discussions and scaffold them into their perspectives and their concerns. I think that when we throw a lot of textual information at them, that we are sometimes hindering them from being fully participative and getting their feedback and their concerns.
I think that's a great suggestion, Luann, and one that I sometimes forget because I'm a very wordy person, and I like to write a lot of things and create templates for writing. So yes, thank you for sharing that and elevating that.
I'll come off of mute. So I'm, just looking at the questions that are on the screen, I do think that a lot of parents and caregivers still struggle with difficulty in understanding how the federal funding is working for their school districts. Like there is, there are segments of informed parents, but I do think there are larger segments of parents and caregivers who don't really understand. And so, but they do have experiences with the programs that their students have benefited from. And so I do think that, hearing that a program that their child may have benefited from will cause some angst and worry about how that child will continue to be supported. So I do think having intentional parenting sessions around, how programs will continue are really important. So establishing, with the district, what those parent engagement sessions will look like, and also including what the plan is for the district, whether they have to phase out a program and what the replacement program is, or if they're continuing in a program, what their strategy is to secure funding to continue that program is really important. So I think, school systems in general, host their own parent engagement sessions, but I do think working with community partners will also be a strategy as a way to reach more parent and caregivers to have that conversation about what the phasing out of ESSER funding will look like.
Rachel, I'll build on what Tamika said. I completely agree. I think this comes down to local schools and local districts being able to effectively communicate and educate the public on, at a much larger scale even, how schools and school districts are funded. I always use my existing structures. I have a parent advisory council, several different student advisory councils, a teacher advisory, a principal, and we're beginning those conversations now about educating our general public on how local schools and local districts are funded, combination of local, state, federal, and examples of ESSER funding that may or may not be going away, or that may be able to be sustained, to Tamika's point, so that our parents and stakeholders are aware of those programs or positions that may be ending. So to me, what I've found is it's a larger question on how we're adequately educating the public on how our schools and school districts are funded. The ESSER then just is one more layer on that we're including this year in our budget priority discussions.
Llewellyn made a very good point right there.
Yes, and I will go ahead and unmute. I just know that we have, a lot of our federal program directors are in the midst of retiring. And when you are coming on and you're new, braiding of funds, other things like that you don't know about when you're brand new because it's so layered and so exhaustive. Having the different offices within NCDPI to be able to support those new directors and understanding this entire process and even some mentorship, I think is absolutely essential, because the new people simply will be overwhelmed and won't understand what to do, how to do it. And that's an important stakeholder group.
I appreciate you all sharing that. To Ms. Walker Kelly and Dr. Houlihan's point, we have also observed kind of that disconnect between the understanding of how funding works for, especially at the school level, when we go on monitoring visits and we meet with parents. A lot of times, yeah, they are not aware. They, like you said, Ms. Walker Kelly, they may be aware of the program, but not necessarily how things are funded and how the funding comes down. So I appreciate you sharing that. And Dr. Houlihan about bringing in those different advisory groups and really educating them on how the district and the schools are funded, and adding ESSER to that layer is very important. We may be asking you to share a bit more with us on that so that we can really drive that home in those regional sessions. And then, of course, Luann, thank you for sharing about the fund braiding. That is something that we have been working with the Office of Federal Programs on, especially looking at how to braid funds to sustain some ESSER programming, but it is a very complicated process and you can go down a lot of rabbit holes. And so I agree with you there as well, that providing support to our new directors that are coming in, especially as ESSER ends in that federal program space, is going to be crucial. Does anyone else have anything they'd like to share before we move on?
All right, thank you, Rachel. So I'm looking at the clock. We've got a little bit more than 15 minutes left on the scheduled agenda, and I want to keep us on track. So we have a few more discussion items that we want to bring up. The first one is really around our current ESSER 3 program funds. This is PRC 189 and 188. I'm going to give it back to Rachel. She has a few questions for us and really looking at the challenges that districts and charters are having in fully spending these funds. So Rachel, I'll give it back to you.
Thank you. And I'm going to go through this really quickly because we talked about this a little bit in our last committee meeting, but I just wanted to provide you all with an update. PRC 189, these are our out of school time academic enrichment programs. Previously, they were only math focused, but we opened up that allotment policy a bit to try to help districts in expending those funds. So now they can spend on both reading, science, and math. There has to be, this instruction has to take place outside of the normal school day, and if it is a traditional school district, it cannot take place during the summer, unfortunately. There are about 64% of those funds remaining, which you see the figure here, about 21.5 million almost, left remaining that has to be spent by the end of this school year. And then we have the Summer Career Accelerator programs, which are PRC 188. These are specific to grades 6 through 12. And they require that the district or charter school partner with an industry or business that's in demand in that particular county. The limitations in terms of offering the program, it can only be offered during the summer. Right now, we have 72% remaining. Obviously, we're not expecting any of that to be spent down right now because we're not in the summer, but that 72%, that 26.1 million has to be spent during this summer. So, by the end of August, essentially. So if we can go to the next slide, Richard. Just to give you a couple of challenges related to these two programs. And again, these are from the state set aside. So these are funds that DPI received and set aside as required by the federal government. And then we have dispersed those funds back out to districts in the form of several programs. And these are the two that are remaining and are administered by our office from ESSER 3. So the challenges with PRC 189, there are staffing issues. Districts and charter schools are having a hard time getting school personnel to stay after school or come earlier before school. There's, as we're all aware, there are staffing shortages, there's teacher burnout. So that is a challenge. The main challenge that we have heard is that we just don't have the folks to staff an after school or before school program. Also, consistent student attendance. It seems that if transportation is offered, attendance is not as big of a challenge, but it still remains a challenge because in some cases, especially in charter schools, the district or the charter school may not receive enough funding to provide transportation to or from the after school program. With the summer career accelerator programs, these are pretty popular programs, especially with staff. So staffing is not an issue, but the attendance is. If you've tried to run a program with high school students in the summer, you know that that is a challenge because a lot of times students in high school are working. So since this is a program that includes both middle and high school, we are having trouble with high school student attendance. And so a lot of times districts have spent money on a contractor and they've already paid that contract, and then they may only have 10 kids show up. So it's not a great ROI, if you will. So these are some questions that we had. What suggestions do you all have to address any of these challenges? And then again, how can we ensure that districts and schools are fully and effectively spending their funds? And because I know we're short on time, if you all need some thought time on this and want to, submit those via email, we're happy to do that as well. But if you have any initial thoughts, please feel free to share them now.
This is Luann again, and we encountered all of those things that you were talking about, PRC 189. So what we did, we have in-person sessions, and we've kind of created like a gaming environment so that it's not just regular school tutoring, and we have leaderboards. And then we're in the process of digitizing and also changing the games into Spanish for our parents. So for parent and family engagement, they can now access those and play with the kids at home. They get that extra practice, and then they come to school in the after school program. Then they have like a quick mini lesson, and then they go ahead and then they do what they're doing, but they do it as a gaming structure, and we have snacks and things like that. And by doing that type of sellout for it and spin to it, we have had much more engagement and kids wanting to come because it's not tutoring, it's in a game competitive structure. And we know our kids love to compete.
That's excellent. Thank you for sharing that example.
Rachel, I'll just say, this may be a very unpopular suggestion, so I'm going to preface my comments on this, and other colleagues and superintendents may not appreciate this. On the PRC 188, that for our county, that has been a very popular program for our high school kids. I've, knock on wood, not had many challenges with staffing or with participation, but I know looking ahead, I will not have the available funds to have a program this summer because of what we've already expended. I do wonder though, if funds were available, and we had a plan for using those funds and could secure the people and the students, could there be a redistribution? So in other words, would you all consider surveying districts or charters to say, hey, instead of this funding sitting there in an account and not being used, the state could collect that and then disperse that back to school systems that have a plan for implementation so it can be used this summer, if that makes any sense. I've not discussed that idea with any of my colleagues, but I'm just sitting here thinking, I know that for us as a school system, we could use additional funding to implement another program that right now, I don't have those funds available. At least that's not forecasted. Just a thought. I don't want to take money away from anyone, but if the concern is that it's going to be reverted back to the feds and other districts could use it, I would support that.
Yes, thank you for that suggestion. And it may be too, that we could do what you mentioned, a survey, because we did have folks that didn't spend their summer career accelerator funds from ESSER 2 for 177. So if they would have known they weren't going to run programs, they could have gone ahead and reverted those and we could have dispersed them accordingly.
And I do think there's some precedents for this before. I believe and Rachel, I can't remember it off the top of my head, but I believe last year we did something similar with another one to ensure we didn't revert funds back. I don't remember the PRC though. Were you in that?
I think it was 176 and 178, which was the CBE tool.
So there is some precedence for doing that, but it does get us squarely into finance, and so we have to get over with our finance team to talk through the logistics of that process. But we always would want those dollars to be used in a really intentional way, and if that means someone decides they don't think they need it, it's saying that up front so that we make sure kids are benefited from those dollars and not just going back to Washington. So. We can look at that.
So I had a few things to name here. So with the staffing challenges with the academic enrichment programs, one of the things that is also really unpopular to put in the room, but is an actual real truth, is that there are educators who love to teach during the summer, but they also have summer jobs, and the pay rates for working for the school district in the summer versus their secondary employment during the summer is a real barrier for them. And so, and also for our instructional support assistants who also like working in those positions, they have to be competitive. Pay rates for those positions. And as far as attendance, part of the other reason why I think many of the programs struggle with attendance from students is because parents they don't really understand the coursework that happens over the summer or the programming for the students over the summer to understand how important it is, other than the fact, like, yes, your student may need to go to summer enrichment because they need to work on reading and math skills, right? So just a more detailed explanation of what occurs in these programs for parents and caregivers during the summer, I think could also help with attendance, in addition to what you named around transportation. And then for PRC 188, one of the things is with our high schoolers who do have jobs, I wonder if there is something to be thought of about high impact but shortened time frame for some of these programs. Thinking if the content could still be delivered in a shorter time frame that is amenable to both students and educators, so that attendance would be better in these programs.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, there's definitely something to be said about high impact in a shorter time frame. And then to the point about competitive teacher and assistant pay, we agree, and we have been in conversations with districts who have reached out to us and said, what is reasonable? And we've actually had lots of programs offering bonuses and things like that within these programs to try to attract teachers and assistants and other support staff, including bus drivers and cafeteria workers. So as districts do reach out about that, we try to provide them with guidance in that front to make sure that pay is competitive. I think we should probably go ahead and move on just because it's 11:24.
All right, if you'll go to the next slide, please. So the The next discussion, very quickly, and Rachel, this might be another one where you might want to just ask for an email for suggestions. I'll leave that to you though. But really, we talked at the last meeting about the timing of the ARP convening, and some of the concerns that committee members shared was really around having this event take place earlier because of the expiration of ESSER funding. DPI heard that request, and as a result, as you've heard today, have scheduled the regional meetings, which is going to be a great chance for discourse and discussion. However, there is a discussion on the table on if we were to have a one-day convening, what would that look like? What would you, as a committee member, find value in that as an agenda? What topics would be helpful? And so we kind of wanted to bring this discussion back, get your general thoughts. And Rachel, I'll leave it to you with the time. If you want to take comments now, we can. Or would you prefer something in writing from committee members? It's up to you.
Yes, let's let folks respond in writing to this, because I know you all have a voting item that you'll need to cover in the next slide. So if you all could please just provide me with some feedback, and Richard, when he sends a follow-up email, can put this question in there for you all to respond to.
Okay. All right, last item. We need to have a quick discussion on, do we need to have another committee meeting? The question is, do you want to schedule? We are not required to have another meeting. We can if we would like to, or we can convene as needed. And so that's really the question on the table. Would this committee like to meet, go ahead and establish a meeting time and date now, or do we prefer to convene as needed? And that would come from Rachel, Andrew, and Richard to schedule if they would like feedback from this committee on any future topics. And as Rachel said, this is an action item, so I will need a motion and a second and a vote.
I do see Luann put in the chat she prefers an established meeting due to her responsibilities.
So if someone moved to have this be an item, and it seems like there's a second, then the chair could move this forward for a vote.
I guess for a point of clarification, and Tamika, I see you unmuted. Are we voting today to establish a meeting date, or are we actually picking a date?
Just to establish whether or not you all would like to establish a meeting date, or if you would like to convene as needed as requested by DPI. And then based on that, we can send out a scheduling poll
Okay.
for like a later date closer to the end of ESSER.
Okay. So I'll take Luann's motion as a motion in the chat if that's agreeable. Lisa has seconded, and then we'll open it for discussion. Tamika, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I was just gonna assist in making the motion. I agree with Luann and Lisa.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Any more discussion? All those in favor, aye?
Aye.
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 So Rachel and team, we'll wait to hear back from you after you send a scheduling poll out. All right, everyone, I believe that brings us to an adjournment. I need a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor? Aye.
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 All right, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Recording stopped.
Ooh, child. Well, actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to reach out to Earl because it was live streamed and it was on YouTube.
I mean, certainly you can do that. I think we'll need something for them to like
Look at.
and I'm gonna do a much briefer, like I typed a lot of stuff, but I'll probably do a much briefer version of the minutes this time, and it'll just other stuff, so I feel like exhausted by that. And then on top of that, it's just like, it's just a tough time. But it'll be good. Hopefully starting like next week, we get a little more, normal. So I'm looking forward to some.
I will just, I'm offering my condolences to you.
I appreciate that.
But just to say to you that whenever you lose an elder that moves you forward in the line, like, how if you're in the military and the general leaves and whatever, what have you, your grandmother, when you tell me about her, when I heard you talk about her, she was one of the leaders in your family.
Yeah, for sure.
And what's going to happen, and this is important, that those who are left behind don't diverge.
Yeah.
But that also means, Uncle Jay, that it's your responsibility to share with your nephew those great things your grandmother taught you, man.
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
That's one of the parts I'm looking forward to. Not this weekend, obviously, it's easy.
it will come.
It'll come, but this weekend it'll be good because I'm excited to see some of the family I don't get to see very often, and we already have like a hotel on Friday night where we're all just gonna hang out and
Celebrate her.
reminisce and enjoy fellowship. So I'm looking forward to all that. I'm gonna have to drink a lot of water this week because it's gonna be a lot of work. It's gonna be rough, but it'll be good
Sounds like she was the matriarch that, to everyone.
for sure. It was just like unexpected. I thought there was more time with her, and then she was doing so well, and we all knew that we needed to kind of hold our breath and not put the cart before the horse, but she was just doing really well, and then in turn, in the course of the day, had another series of mini strokes, and then it was just like, well, now she's not responsive. But I will forever be grateful that I went on Monday of last week to visit her, and she was able to talk, and Bridget and I met with her, we talked with her. It was hard to hear a little bit, but she was able to like express things, and she told me to take care of myself, and I was like, well, it's not, I'm not going anywhere yet, like, let's take it one day at a time. But some of the things we were able to share in that hour and a half, 2 hours, will stick with me forever, because that was, I didn't know the time was going to last, so I talked to her.
You never did.
So,
You never did.
and my granddad's still in Henderson, so like I'm glad that we're in Raleigh. We're gonna be able to see him and make sure he's okay and checking on him. But he's 83, 84, and just lost his partner 55 years, and he has a community, but she was the person who dictated their family things.
I'm gonna tell you something that's gonna be hard. Like, I didn't know how hard my father's death was for my mother until her passing. And I went through, and I was like, wow, you can see. Like right now, I'm going through the pictures, boxes and boxes of pictures. I mean, picture me I didn't even know existed. The way I'm sitting there in this fake fur, this rat fur coat, sitting there just cheesing like crazy.
Yes.
But when I say that about your nephew, I don't know if I ever shared this with you, but I have a nephew that's really, literally serving life.
Oh wow.
Yeah, my brother has been trash dad. So I'm just gonna be honest. I love my brother, but it's been a trash father.
Yeah.
And so my nephew isn't even talking to him right now. So when he calls, and sometimes there's some frustration there, but I have to mentor him through that.
Sure.
And the one thing that we did this last time I talked to him was I shared family history. He didn't know anything, because I didn't realize it, but my uncle took me around so much family that I knew family members, and my brother would say, how do you know them? I said, oh, Randy, because it was never my dad.
Right.
My dad didn't do that. My dad, he had like certain cousins he dealt with, but that was it. My uncle Randy dealt with everybody, kind of like me. So when I talked to him and I talked him through it, there was a certain piece I felt him take on.
Yeah.
And sadly, I was thrust way ahead of the line that I wanted before I wanted to be, to say this to you, you're gonna have to be a resource because your dad is going to have some responsibilities he's never had before. You know, I know it sounds weird,
Yeah.
but my daughter was my biggest, like, except for my wife, my daughter was my pillar. She told her husband, she said, I've never seen my dad cry this much in my entire life than I have in these past 2 days. So give him that grace. You deserve it as well. You're gonna mourn, lean into it.
Yeah, for sure.
But when it's all said and done and the smoke settles, look around and pull your family close, man.
I will. I'm gonna use this as an opportunity to try to be a little more intentional about spending the time with my granddad, just because he is, 50 minutes away.
You're
It's
right.
not, I'm the closest person in the family to him physically other than his, they're all stepsons, but his son Greg, my uncle Greg lives up in Henderson too, so like he and his wife live around them, so they can participate with him, but other than that, me and Richard are the closest ones, so I'm gonna try to use this as a time to kind of make sure I can be a part of that. But my dad was born when my grandmother was 15, so they're almost more like siblings.
Yeah.
And so my dad's already been sort of he's the one who starts the family group chat every holiday. He's the one who
He's
reaches out.
actually the big brother
He
he's
already
supposed
is.
to be.
He already is like.
Yeah,
running-
he's the big
running
brother
back.
he's supposed
He's
to
doing
be.
the eulogy at the funeral, and my granddad's already said that he's gonna do the eulogy at his funeral, so like, my dad's kind of he is stepping into that patriarch role, even if he wasn't
didn't want
there. He honestly enjoys it. He loves
That-
family, and he loves that stuff. So
Good.
he's, I'm not, and today's actually his birthday, but I'm,
Oh.
so it's kind of a weird time for him.
Share happy birthday with him, but
I texted him and I was like, it's an odd one, I know.
you're his only son, right?
Yeah, my older sister, and then I'm
Oh yeah, dude, you don't realize it, but that's your yeah, yeah. It's weird, Jay. I mean, but I forget that I'm 50. And like seriously, like my grandmother died. My last grandparent died when I was 28,
oh, wow, okay.
and I wasn't even close to her really.
Yeah.
But when you say that about your grandfather, just like I said, I did the same thing. I said I'm gonna make sure I spend more time with mom. Mom, you gonna know, and you're right. But even as much as, because I talked to her every morning, I went to go see, did all this other stuff, and I still, when I looked, I said, oh my gosh, you were so alone. So yeah, so
Weird like that.
you and Bridget go down there and have fun, man. Enjoy, and I'm gonna be praying for you, man.
Appreciate that. I appreciate that.
I know I'm not really, I'm not a Bible thumper, but I am a believer, and I think that